Greetings YouTube, this is Remarkable Republican, here once again to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. I've been busy lately, studying science and history. These topics have always interested me, but it's only been in the last couple of years where I've really had some major breakthroughs. I'm still very proud of the discovery that I made regarding carbon-14 being a hoax, but I've discovered something perhaps even more important. And that is incontrovertible proof that the Vikings came from America rather than from Europe. This is something that I have believed for a long time, but up until this point I have not had enough evidence. So, what I'd like to do in this video is show you my evidence and then prove that the Vikings must be from America and not from Europe. There was, therefore, no Viking discovery of America, but rather a Viking rediscovery of America. So you need to get that straight right now. Many of you are not really aware of geology because you're too stuck on continental drift and other fallacies promoted by the evolutionist. The truth is that the world is not as old as so-called mainstream scientists say, and that from the very outset, man has been among the creatures of the earth. Thousands of years ago, geology tells us that there were sea dinosaurs in the middle of the United States. Back then, there was more water on Earth, it was wetter, and the inland sea covered what is now the Great Plains of the US and Canada. This sea was pretty shallow, but there were creatures in it, including dinosaurs, sharks, and, yes, men with boats. And by the way, you know who does really well with boats in shallow water? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. One thing that's interesting is that from this period, thousands of years ago when the inland sea still existed, we have found fossils of dinosaurs who swam, called Biaxolopoda. And what's weird about these fossils, what's completely unique about them, is that they are being found buried face up and not the other way around. If you know anything at all about how bodies float in water, especially dead bodies, you know that all bodies are face down. If you find a murder victim in a river, he or she will be facing down. So, for something to be buried at the floor of the water facing up is obvious proof that it was placed there deliberately. You can't simply put a body in the river and then it will settle that way. That does not happen. It is not physically possible. So the question is then, who did this? Or perhaps what did this? But in this case, it's very much a matter of who did this. What people inhabited the inland sea and had the skills necessary to pull something like this off? Ponder that. We know for a fact that ancient humans fought sea monsters and hunted many of them to extinction. We see this in all of the earliest histories of man. Of course, men, once they developed high-powered weapons, became the masters of the sea, but this was our inheritance only after we discovered means to kill things that are formidable. We also know that the sea monsters that we're finding buried face up must have been killed by relatively advanced technology. The Native Americans were not very good seafarers. They only had canoes. A canoe would be a death sentence against a sea monster like the one that you see here, the Biaxolopoda. So, who had the skills needed and also metal weapons in order to kill a dinosaur? Which civilization had the military skills needed to do something like this? Because yes, it would take more than one person to kill an animal like this. The Vikings. We also know that the Vikings were in North America and had the ability to cross large bodies of water. They were very, very good fighters. In fact, in the Middle Ages, they were often paid big amounts of money by the kings of France and other countries for their services. So they're really the only candidates who could have pulled this off. No one from Asia had the ability to do this at the time, so it had to be the Vikings. Let's talk about the skills the Vikings had which enabled them to actually do this to this dinosaur, and how they got to where they were. It's obvious that the Vikings must be from North America because the inland sea is the best place to develop seafaring skills. It was shallow and relatively calm, similar to something like the Great Lakes. And Viking ships are very good in shallow water, so it makes sense that they would have been developed especially for the conditions of the inland sea. As that began to dry up, they then moved out of the area, eventually reaching Europe and other parts of the world. But it was only because of the skills they developed here in the Midwest. And as the natives of America, they were the only people who could or would travel to this location. As seafarers, the Vikings were expert divers. We know this for a fact. And they didn't have diving suits or tanks, so what they would do is they would go underwater for several minutes at a time. They'd really practice and get good at holding their breath. And the inland sea being very shallow, it would be possible to reach the bottom. So after you kill a dinosaur and it's floating face down, you can then flip it over and drag it down with a group of divers, and you'll have enough time once you reach the bottom to dig a little hole and shove it in. Perhaps put something heavy on top of it to make sure that it stays down, an extra anchor or what have you. We know that the Indians not only could not have killed one of these things because of their primitive technology, but also the way that they killed animals was very different than what the Vikings did. The Vikings would always show respect to mighty foes, including honorable burials. So for instance, when the Viking Beowulf killed the monster Grendel, he buried it. And that was just one story from the Vikings. There are all kinds of other ones as well. And it's very clear that that was part of the ethos of what they did. The Indians would kill things as they needed them. They were very conscientious about not killing too much. They were sort of proto-hippies in a way. But at the same time, they didn't have a ritual part of it because they didn't really have a religion. They weren't advanced enough for something like a ritual religion like Christianity or something like that. But the Vikings were. Now, they didn't have Christianity, they were some sort of pagans, but they still had a lot of ritual and myth and things going on. And burying a sea monster at sea, or a swimming dinosaur in this case, is exactly what the Vikings would do because it makes the most sense. They would bury a warrior in his native environment to honor him and make sure that he is at his home. So, all of this adds up to the fact that these dinosaurs can only be where they're at because of the Vikings. Knowing what we know now from my research, let us ask a few big questions. When did the dinosaurs die off, and did our ancestors kill them all? We don't know the exact date when the last dinosaurs died, but clearly it was thousands of years ago. It's not exactly clear how long it took our ancestors to kill them, but I think it's abundantly clear that once humans developed metal weapons, the dinosaurs' days were numbered. I assume that not only were they a threat to humans because they were very powerful, but also they probably tasted pretty good. They are reptiles after all, and if you ever had alligator meat, you know that it's quite delicious. Did the Vikings reach the middle of North America prior to the Indians? I certainly believe so, and I think that at this point, it's abundantly clear that the original inhabitants of North America were white. That's the only thing that Professor Graham Hancock won't accept. He still tries to promote this idea that maybe they weren't white, but the Vikings are white, and clearly they came from North America, and they were here first. They got booted by the Indians. I think that's the way that the evidence points. And the reason is because the inland sea dried up, so without the inland sea, a massive overland invasion pushed the Vikings out, and this is what allowed them to preserve their sea technology, which they otherwise might have lost in exchange for becoming better at farming. So instead of becoming grain farmers, they took to the seas and ended up in Norway and Danish and the other countries up there. So did the Vikings originate in America and move to Vinland later? Yes, that is exactly what happened. That is the only thing that makes sense in light of all of the evidence that we have. All of the evidence, so far as I'm aware, points to an all-white America in the earliest days of creation. The Indians came later, and then the white man came back. As we know, the Vikings are from America, and they're white. They used their ships to leave America and then spread all over Europe. That is the reason why Europe has white people now. If not for the American Vikings, Europe would be Middle Eastern or Latino or some other ethnicity. Viking mythology is the oldest in the world, with the exception, of course, of the one true religion. But that is not a mythology, so I can say confidently Viking mythology is the oldest in the world. And if it came from America, this would make sense because Viking mythology is more distinctive than other traditions. It has slightly different points of reference. The stories are different. The gods are a little different. Well, if they came from a different land and they encountered sea dinosaurs that didn't live elsewhere, that makes sense. Perhaps the story of Beowulf, the best known of the Viking tales, was a distant memory of something that happened in the inland sea, somewhere in Kansas. All of this is compatible with the research of Professor Graham Hancock, except for the whiteness part that I was talking about earlier. Hancock says that the first ever civilization was right here in North America, and that it then spread to the rest of the world. And I believe that the evidence is completely on his side, and that with this presentation I have corrected some of the faults in his thinking. He also believes the world is much older than it actually is, but overall I think that he's a fine scholar. I'm just correcting him around the edges using my knowledge. Until next time, I'm Remarkable Republican. I'm bringing you the truth with truth-flavored bias, and I'm signing out for now. But look out for my published paper or book on this subject in the near future. I think that I have finally struck upon gold, something which will make my name and reshape the field forever.